There is a place in New York City where people from every corner of the earth once came to chase the same dream. You could stand on a single street corner and hear a dozen languages. You could eat food from 30 different countries within a few blocks. It was the most diverse place on the entire planet, a borough where the whole world had gathered, all pursuing one simple idea: work hard, and you can build a better life here. For 100 years, that place was the definition of the American dream made real. It was where crowded families from the tenements escaped to get a home with a little patch of grass. It was where immigrants stepped off the boat and the plane and clawed their way into the middle class. It was, quite literally, where America went to show off the future, hosting 2 enormous World's Fairs that promised a shining tomorrow. That place is Queens, New York. And today, something strange is happening. People are leaving. The borough that the entire world once wanted to move to is watching its population shrink. In just a couple of years, it lost over 100,000 people. The families who would once have clawed their way into Queens are now clawing their way out. Priced out, taxed out, squeezed out. So the question this video asks is a simple one, with an answer that turns out to be about far more than one New York borough. Why does nobody move to Queens anymore? Because the story of how Queens rose, and why it's now stalling, is really the story of the American dream itself. What it was, how it was built, and why, for millions of people, it now feels like it's slipping out of reach. Let's go back to the beginning. Before the airports and the World's Fairs, when Queens was mostly farmland, and the birthplace of one of America's founding ideas. Long before it was part of New York City, the land that is now Queens was a scattering of small towns and farms on the western end of Long Island. It was settled in the 1600s under the Dutch, and then the English, with little villages that still give their names to Queens neighborhoods today. Flushing, Jamaica, Astoria, Elmhurst. For a long time this was quiet country. Farms, orchards, fishing villages, a rural landscape feeding the growing city across the river. But something remarkable happened here in 1657 in the little town of Flushing that would echo through all of American history. At the time, the Dutch governor of the colony, a hard man named Peter Stuyvesant, had banned the practice of the Quaker religion. He was persecuting Quakers, punishing anyone who sheltered them. And the residents of Flushing, most of whom weren't even Quakers themselves, did something extraordinarily brave. They wrote and signed a formal protest, a document telling the governor that they would not obey his order because they believed people had the right to worship as their conscience demanded. It was called the Flushing Remonstrance, and it is considered one of the earliest and most important expressions of religious freedom in American history. A direct ancestor of the idea, later enshrined in the Constitution, that everyone in America has the right to their own faith. The story went even further. A few years later, a Flushing farmer named John Bown openly allowed Quakers to hold their meetings in his home, in direct defiance of the ban. He was arrested, fined, and eventually banished from the colony. But he sailed to Holland and took his case directly to the Dutch authorities who governed the colony. And astonishingly, he won. The Dutch West India Company ordered Governor Stuyvesant to back off and allow religious tolerance, for the practical reason that a diverse, welcoming colony would attract more settlers and prosper. That decision, that it was better to let all kinds of people live and worship freely side by side, helped set the entire future course of New York, and of Queens in particular. The most diverse place on earth was, in a sense, founded on that exact principle more than 350 years ago. It's a stunning thing to realize. The principle of religious tolerance, one of the founding ideas of the United States, has some of its deepest roots right here, in what would become Queens. From its very beginnings, this was a place defined by the radical notion that all kinds of different people could live side by side. It was the most diverse place on earth before anyone even had the words for it. For the next 2 centuries, though, Queens stayed mostly rural. It was the quiet countryside east of the great exploding city of New York. And then, At the turn of the 20th century, everything changed, because Queens became part of that city, and the modern world came roaring across the river. The year that changed everything was 1898. That was the year of the Great Consolidation, when the independent cities and towns of the region were merged into a single Greater New York City made up of 5 boroughs: Manhattan, Brooklyn, the Bronx, Staten Island, and Queens. Overnight, the farmland of Queens was officially part of what was becoming the largest and most powerful city in America. But being part of the city on paper wasn't enough to transform Queens. What transformed Queens was steel. Bridges and trains. In 1909, the Queensboro Bridge opened, connecting Queens directly to Manhattan across the East River. And even more importantly, the subways and elevated trains began pushing out into Queens. Through deals struck in the 1910s, the transit lines extended out of crowded Manhattan and Brooklyn, reaching into what was still, at the time, the open pastures and fields of Queens. And that single fact, a train line reaching into empty land close to the greatest job market in America, set off one of the great building booms in American history. Because here is what the trains made possible. In Manhattan, millions of people were packed into dense, dark, crowded tenements. Immigrant families and working people crammed into airless apartments, often several families to a floor. It was the densest urban living on the continent, and now suddenly those families had an option. For the price of a train ticket, they could live out in Queens, where the land was cheap and open, where a person could actually afford a small house or a bright new apartment with windows and light and maybe a tree out front, and still commute into the city for work in half an hour. Queens became the escape valve, the place you moved up to. If you had grown up 6 to a room in a Lower East Side tenement and you worked hard and saved your money, the dream was to get out, to get your family to Queens, to space and air and a front stoop of your own. Queens was where the working class of New York went to become the middle class. And they came by the hundreds of thousands. The growth was almost dizzying. In 1900, Queens had well under 200,000 people. Within a few decades, it had blown past 1 million, and it just kept climbing. Farms that had grown vegetables for the city one year were subdivided into building lots the next, and rows of houses and apartment buildings marched across them. The pattern repeated over and over. The trains arrived, the developers followed, the fields disappeared, and a new neighborhood full of striving families sprang up almost overnight. It was one of the fastest transformations of land in American history. An entire county turning from farmland into a middle-class metropolis in a single lifetime. The farmland vanished under a tidal wave of construction. And it wasn't chaotic slum building. A lot of it was thoughtful, even beautiful. Queens became a showcase for a new idea of how ordinary people could live well. This was the era when Queens perfected the American middle-class dream in brick and grass. Developers built entire planned communities designed around light, air, and green space. In neighborhoods like Jackson Heights, they built elegant garden apartments. Apartment complexes built around large shared interior gardens, and they helped pioneer the idea of the co-op, where ordinary families could own their apartments. In Sunnyside, they built Sunnyside Gardens, a carefully planned community of homes and green courtyards, inspired by the most progressive urban planning ideas of the age. In Forest Hills, they built Forest Hills Gardens, a gorgeous planned neighborhood that looked like an English village. And across vast stretches of the borough, they built the thing that would define Queens forever. Mile after mile of modest, sturdy, single-family and two-family homes, each with its own little patch of yard. Jackson Heights is worth pausing on, because it captures the whole idea. It was developed by a company that's actually essentially invented a new way of living for the middle class. Building blocks of apartment buildings that shared beautifully landscaped private gardens in their interior courtyards, and selling the apartments to families as co-ops so they could own rather than rent. The developers even coined the very term garden apartment to market it. The whole concept was aspiration made real estate. You weren't just renting a room in a grim tenement anymore. You were an owner, with a garden, a stake in something. It was the middle-class dream, packaged and sold, and families lined up for it. This was the promise, made physical. A home of your own, a yard for the kids, a safe, green, decent neighborhood, a short train ride to a good job in the city. It was everything the crowded, striving families of New York had ever wanted, and Queens delivered it on an enormous scale. By the middle of the 20th century, the borough's population had exploded from a few 100,000 to well over 1.5 million people. And it was still climbing. Queens had become the very definition of moving up in America. And the world took notice. Because twice, in the span of a single generation, Queens was chosen to host the future itself in 1939 and again in 1964. New York held two of the largest World's Fairs ever staged, and both of them were held in Queens on a former ash dump in Flushing Meadows that was transformed into a gleaming fairground. The World's Fair was a very big deal in that era. It was where the nations and corporations of the world came to show off their vision of tomorrow. The newest inventions, the boldest dreams of what human life was about to become. And the fairs in Queens were spectacular. The 1939 fair, held on the eve of the Second World War, was themed The World of Tomorrow. Its two great symbols were the Trilon and the Perisphere, a soaring white spike and a giant white globe, futuristic and pure, that became famous around the world. It had a town of tomorrow full of futuristic model homes, and its most beloved attraction was General Motors' famous Futurama exhibit, an enormous, breathtaking model of the America of the future, of 1960, complete with superhighways and gleaming skyscrapers and automated cities which visitors glided over in moving chairs while a narrator described the wonders to come. People waited in line for hours and came out wearing pins that read simply, "I have seen the future," and they had seen it in Queens. The fair also introduced ordinary Americans to inventions that would define the coming age. A strange new device called television, along with air conditioning and nylon stockings. Millions of people came to Queens to see the future. Then, in 1964, it happened again. Another giant World's Fair on the same Queens fairgrounds. This one masterminded by Robert Moses, the same power broker who reshaped so much of New York, who used the fair as a way to finally turn those ash heaps and fairgrounds into a permanent great park. And this fair gave the borough its most enduring symbol, the Unisphere, an enormous stainless steel globe of the earth, 12 stories tall and hollow, that still stands in Flushing Meadows today, and remains one of the most recognizable landmarks in all of New York. The 1964 fair was a celebration of peace through understanding and the space-age optimism of the era, with dozens of nations and hundreds of companies showing off the wonders to come. A giant model of the Earth. In the world's borough, it could not have been more fitting. Think about what that meant for Queens. Not once, but twice. When America wanted to show the entire world its vision of the shining future, it chose Queens as the stage. This borough of middle-class strivers and garden apartments was, in the eyes of the world, the place where tomorrow lived. Optimism itself had an address, and it was in Queens. And there was one more thing being built in Queens in these years, to transform not just the borough, but the entire country. Two of them, actually. Airports. In 1939, LaGuardia Airport opened in Queens. And in 1948, an even bigger one opened nearby. First called Idlewild, later renamed John F. Kennedy International Airport. Together, these two airports in Queens became the great aerial gateway to the United States. If you were flying into New York City, flying into America, from almost anywhere in the world, there was a very good chance that the first American ground your feet touched was in Queens. There's a beautiful symmetry in that. A century earlier, immigrants had arrived in New York by ship, sailing past the Statue of Liberty into the harbour. Now they arrived by air, descending over the rooftops of Queens. And for enormous numbers of them, they didn't just land in Queens. They stayed. Why travel any farther when the plane had already set you down in a borough full of people from your own country, with your own food, your own language, and a train straight to the biggest job market on earth? The airport wasn't just a gateway you passed through. For millions, it was the doorstep of their new American home. And that turned out to be perfectly, poetically fitting, because Queens was about to become the single greatest gateway for immigrants in the entire country. And it would transform this borough of middle-class strivers into the most diverse place that has ever existed on the face of the earth. The Great Transformation came in 1965. For decades, American immigration law had been designed to keep the country overwhelmingly European, with strict quotas that all but shut the door on immigrants from Asia, Africa, and much of the rest of the world. But in 1965, a landmark new immigration law swept those old racial quotas away, and for the first time in generations, America opened its doors to the entire world. And the world came. And an astonishing share of it came to Queens. Why Queens? For all the reasons it had always drawn people. It had affordable housing. It had the subway and the jobs. It sat right next to those two international airports, often the literal point of arrival. And it already had that deep, centuries-old character, going all the way back to the Flushing Remonstrance, as a place where different kinds of people lived side by side. So the new arrivals came from every nation on earth, and they poured into Queens. Chinese and Korean immigrants built a thriving second Chinatown and a Koreatown in Flushing. Indians, Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, and Colombians and other Latin Americans transformed Jackson Heights into one of the most diverse neighborhoods on the planet. Greeks made Astoria their own. Immigrants from across Latin America filled Corona and Elmhurst. Guyanese and Punjabi communities built up Richmond Hill. Caribbean and West African communities settled in Jamaica and beyond. Neighborhood by neighborhood, Queens became a living map of the entire world. To walk through Queens today is to travel the entire world in an afternoon. There is one street in particular, Roosevelt Avenue, that runs for miles beneath the elevated train, and along it you pass, block by block, through country after country. You can eat Colombian arepas, then Mexican tacos, then Ecuadorian ceviche, then Nepali momos, then Indian dosas, then Chinese hand-pulled noodles, without ever getting on a plane. You hear Spanish and Bengali and Punjabi and Tibetan and Mandarin, and a dozen tongues you can't identify. The signs on the shops are in scripts from all over the world. In a single square mile, you can find more of the human race gathered together than almost anywhere else that has ever existed. The result is almost impossible to comprehend. Today, Queens is widely recognized as the most ethnically diverse urban area on the planet. It literally holds a Guinness World Record for it. Depending on how you count, well over 100 languages are spoken in the borough. And by some counts, when you include the rare and endangered tongues that immigrants have carried here from remote corners of the globe, the number of languages spoken in Queens may run into the hundreds, perhaps as many as 800. There is no place on earth where more of humanity's languages can be heard than in this one New York borough. They started calling it the world's borough. And for once, the nickname was simple fact. But here is the most important thing to understand about all these new arrivals. The thing that connects them directly to the Irish and Italian and Jewish families who had come to Queens generations before. They came for the exact same reason. The dream had not changed. These were, overwhelmingly, aspirational people, many of them middle class in their home countries, all of them determined to work hard and climb. They came to Queens to do what everyone before them had done: get a job, save money, buy a home, and give their children a better life than they'd had. The faces and the languages changed completely, but the dream, the reason people moved to Queens, stayed exactly the same. Queens was still the place you went to move up, and make no mistake about how hard they worked for it. The romance of the immigrant dream can hide the grind underneath it. The families pouring into Queens took the jobs that keep a great city running, driving the taxis, staffing the hospitals, cooking in the restaurants, cleaning the offices, running the small shops with the lights on late. Often a whole family would pool its wages, several people working several jobs, everyone squeezing into one apartment, saving every dollar for years toward that down payment. A man who'd been an engineer or a teacher in his home country might drive a cab in Queens so that his kids could go to college and become the engineer or the teacher here. That was the bargain. And generation after generation, people took it because Queens held up its end. The work was brutal, but at the end of it, the dream was actually reachable. That is the thing that made Queens sacred. Not that it was easy, but that the hard work actually paid off. And out of that incredible mix of the whole world striving together in one place came an outpouring of culture that shaped America. Queens has always punched far above its weight culturally, precisely because it gathered so much of the world into one place. In the world of jazz, some of the greatest musicians who ever lived made Queens their home. The legendary Louis Armstrong, one of the most important figures in the history of American music, lived out the last decades of his life in a modest house in the Corona neighborhood, a house that is now a museum. And he was far from alone. Jazz greats like Ella Fitzgerald, Count Basie, and Dizzy Gillespie made their homes in the same corner of Queens, drawn to a place where a black artist could own a comfortable home in peace. And a few decades later, Queens became one of the great birthplaces of hip-hop, the sound of a new America. The list of legends who came out of this one borough is staggering. Run-DMC, who broke hip-hop into the mainstream, came out of the Hollis neighborhood. LL Cool J came out of Queens. A Tribe Called Quest came out of St. Albans. And from the Queensbridge houses, the largest public housing project in the entire country, came Nas, whose album about life in those very projects is considered one of the greatest records ever made, along with a whole constellation of other artists. Later would come stars like 50 Cent and Nicki Minaj, raised in the neighborhoods of Queens. The children of that global, striving borough helped turn hip-hop into the dominant music of the entire world. The borough was also a long-time capital of American filmmaking, with major movie studios operating in Astoria, from the silent film era all the way to today, where countless famous films and TV shows have been made. And it hosted the world in sports, from the Mets at their ballpark to the U.S. Open tennis tournament, held every year right there in Flushing Meadows, on the very grounds of the old world's fairs. The borough that gathered the world gave an enormous amount back to it. This was Queens at its absolute height. The most diverse place on earth, the gateway to America, the home of the future, the middle-class dream, and a culture that shaped the whole planet. If any place on earth had earned the right to be optimistic about the future, it was Queens. So how, after all of that, do we arrive at a video called "Why Nobody Moves to Queens Anymore"? What happened? The answer is not that Queens became dangerous, or ugly, or ruined. Queens is still vibrant, still diverse, still full of life and energy, and some of the best food on the planet. The answer is something quieter, and in a way more troubling. The answer is that the dream Queens was built to deliver. The whole reason people moved there for 100 years has become too expensive to reach. Let's go back to that original promise. For generations, the magic of Queens was that a working person, a factory worker, a shopkeeper, a taxi driver, a nurse, could move there and, with hard work and time, buy a home. That was the entire point. Queens was the affordable on-ramp to the American middle class. A modest house in Queens was the finish line that a striving family could actually reach. That is the part that has broken. Over the past few decades, and especially in recent years, the cost of living in Queens, and in all of New York City, has soared to staggering heights. That modest house that a factory worker could buy in the 1950s now costs a fortune, far out of reach for the very kind of working family it was built for. Rents have climbed relentlessly. The price of simply existing in the borough, housing, taxes, everyday costs, has risen faster than ordinary wages, year after year. The on-ramp to the middle class got a toll booth, and the toll kept going up until huge numbers of people simply couldn't afford to get on anymore. Do the arithmetic that a young family faces today. The kind of small two-family house in Queens that a working man could buy in 1955 on a single factory paycheck, the exact house that made Queens the American dream, now sells for the better part of $1 million and often well over it. To buy it, you need an income most working families simply don't have. To rent a decent apartment, you can spend half your paycheck or more before you've bought a single meal. And on top of the housing, there are some of the highest taxes in the country and a cost of living that grinds down even good salaries. A nurse, a teacher, a mechanic, a small business owner. The very backbone of what Queens always was, increasingly looks at the math and realizes it simply does not work anymore. You can spend your whole life working hard in Queens and never get any closer to owning a piece of it. And that is the exact opposite of what Queens was built to be. Meanwhile, 1,000 miles away, the cheaper, booming cities of the South and West are offering the very thing Queens used to offer: an affordable house, a yard, a shot at getting ahead. So the strivers do the same thing strivers have always done. They follow the dream to wherever it's still affordable. A century ago, that meant leaving the crowded tenements of Manhattan for the open promise of Queens. Today, for many, it means leaving Queens for Texas, or the Carolinas, or Florida. The destination changed. The instinct is identical, and so, for the first time in its modern history, Queens started shrinking. In the years around the pandemic, the borough lost population at a startling rate, dropping more than 5% in just a couple of years, from around 2.4 million people down toward 2.2 million. Well over 100,000 people gone. And the studies of where they went tell the whole story. Most of them didn't leave because Queens had become terrible. They left in search of somewhere they could afford, moving to cheaper parts of New York State, to New Jersey, and increasingly to the booming, cheaper cities of the South and West. They were chasing the same thing their grandparents had chased when they first moved to Queens: an affordable place to build a decent life. Except now, that place was somewhere else. The pandemic accelerated it. Remote work meant many people no longer had to live near the city at all, and the desire for more space and lower costs pulled them away. But the pandemic only sped up a trend that was already there, driven by the deeper problem. The math of the American dream had stopped working in Queens, and that is the real, deeper story here. The reason this is about so much more than one borough, because Queens was never just a place. Queens was the physical embodiment of a promise. The promise that in America, if you work hard, you can move up. That you can go from a crowded rented room to a home of your own. That your children can have more than you did. Queens was where that promise was built. In brick and grass and garden apartments, for wave after wave of newcomers, for 100 years. And the reason people are now leaving Queens is the same reason so many Americans everywhere feel that the dream itself is slipping away. The price of the ticket into the middle class, a home, some security, a decent life in a good place, has risen faster than ordinary people's ability to pay for it. It's not that people stopped wanting the dream. It's that the dream got too expensive. And when the on-ramp to the middle class becomes unaffordable, people don't stop striving. They just have to go looking for it somewhere cheaper, somewhere new, the way strivers always have. There's a painful irony in it. Queens didn't fail. In a sense, Queens succeeded too well. It became so desirable, so valuable, so beloved by the whole world, that it priced out the very working families it was created to lift up. The machine of upward mobility worked so beautifully for so long that it made itself unaffordable. The escape valve got expensive enough that people now have to escape from it. But let's be careful not to write the obituary too soon, because that would be a mistake, and it wouldn't be true. Queens is not dying. It remains one of the most vibrant, most diverse, most alive places on the entire planet. Immigrants still come. People still strive. The streets are still filled with the languages and the food and the ambition of the whole world. The dream isn't dead in Queens. It's just gotten much, much harder, which is exactly what has happened to the American dream everywhere. So what is the real lesson of Queens? It's a story about what a country owes to its own promise. For 100 years, Queens was living proof that the American dream was real, that an ordinary person from anywhere on earth could come here, work hard, and climb into a better life. It was the most successful machine for upward mobility that any city has ever built. And it did it while gathering more of humanity into one place than anywhere else on the planet, mostly in peace. That is one of the quiet miracles of the modern world, and it happened in a few square miles of New York that most of the country flies right over. The reason nobody moves to Queens anymore is not that Queens got worse. It's that the thing Queens was for, turning strivers into homeowners, turning the working class into the middle class, got too expensive to deliver. And that should worry us, because Queens is the canary in the coal mine for the whole country. If even Queens, the ultimate land of opportunity, the world's borough, the place that hosted the future twice, can no longer keep its promise to ordinary working people, then we have to ask a hard question about whether that promise still works anywhere. Queens spent 100 years showing America what its dream looked like when it came true. Now it may be showing us something else. What happens when that dream gets locked behind a price that ordinary people can no longer pay? And whether we can figure out how to open that door again may be one of the most important questions this country faces. The world's borough is still standing, still striving, still the most diverse place on earth. The only question is, who will still be able to afford to call it home? If you found this story as remarkable as I did, consider subscribing. There are dozens more American cities and neighborhoods with histories just as astonishing and just as forgotten, and we're going to tell every one of them